Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar that we're holding. We're nearly at our start time, so if you can just hold tight and we'll wait for everyone to join, maybe 1 or 2 minutes into the half hour, and then we'll commence the webinar. Thank you. Hello, thanks for joining. I'm just letting you know that we'll be starting the webinar in about 1 minute time, so please just hold there patiently and I'll be with you in a minute. So hello everyone, my name is Todd Redwood, and thanks for joining the FSSC Audit Options webinar that we've put together here to explain to you some of the options available to certificate holders of FSSC 22,000 certificates globally. We're going to start the webinar in a minute and take you through this, and I'll just explain to you some of the logistics in a minute. So I'm showing my face now. I'm going to take myself away and then just show you the presentation and walk you through it. So we have just some logistical information to share with you. Your microphones have all been automatically muted just to prevent any interference during the webinar. And we'll have about 30-35 minutes of presentation and then 20-25 minutes of question time. If you'd like to ask any questions throughout, please just use the chat function to be able to submit those questions to a moderator who will then ask me the questions at the end. We'll respond to as many of those as we can during the time that we've got. You'll also receive a link in an email after this, after the webinar, with a recording of the webinar, as well as some guides and information about remote auditing, just to assist you with your remote auditing journeys. So as I mentioned, my name is Todd Redwood. I'm the Global Food and Retail Supply Chain Operations and Compliance Director for BSI. I'm based in Sydney in Australia, and I look after BSI's 32 country operations in the food sector to make sure that what we do is kept compliant and sustainable for our clients and for us in BSI. And this is the agenda of items that we'll talk about today on the webinar. Firstly, we'll talk about what the food sector's general position has been on remote auditing. Then we'll talk about the options that FSSC 22000 has presented to us. Talk about some of the benefits and challenges of remote auditing, and then some tips and technology that's used for remote audits, and then of course the time for questions at the end. So the food sector, strangely, has been quite slow. In fact, there's been a bit of a mixed response. There have been certain parts of the food sector that have been very open arms to the concept of remote auditing, although there's been quite a lot of objection to it, and quite slow to accept. And even still, there's not a 100% agreement across the entire global food sector about the efficacy of remote audits. GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative, which sits as the overarching body covering all of the private food schemes that, like FSSC 22000, initially came out with a policy that said there would be no remote audits and only allowing certificate extensions. And those certificate extensions would last for up to 6 months. And then if an audit wasn't able to perform, then there would be the certificate would become invalid. GFSI then moved on to create a policy which allowed for partial remote audits a little later on, so about halfway through this year, but several months into the pandemic. Many of the retailers globally, as well as the brand names, followed GFSI's position because they had previously attached themselves to the GFSI way of thinking and the GFSI certification mechanisms. And we did see some regulators around the world that were more accommodating, more welcoming to remote audits, but generally there was still a reluctance. Now we're more than 6 months on from the beginning of the pandemic, which in certification world is known as a serious event. And this serious event has created a realization that remote auditing has now become necessary because access to sites has been compromised, ongoing as well. We find ourselves in a position where the pandemic continues, and we're talking about second waves in certain parts of the world. Other parts are still being heavily hit by the first wave, and it's basically becoming quite difficult for the supply chain to be able to see how safe the food is being that's being created or made. So remote auditing will give a degree of visibility to the supply chain, and it's actually a very effective tool. So effective, in fact, that the BSI has been working on its remote audit processes for quite some time now, about 5 years. So our remote auditing capability is certainly not in response to the pandemic. In fact, we were well and truly prepared for that. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we've delivered over 70,000 days of remote audit globally, and very effectively as well, because we were so prepared for this type of auditing. So with FSSC 22000, the options that have been created are predominantly prefaced around sites that are not accessible for travel or not accessible at the site level itself. If a site is accessible, well then, or that travel is permitted or possible, then a regular audit is generally the way to deal with that. There is the possibility of using one of these options I'm talking about today in normal situations, but generally speaking, access equals normal audit, no access equals some form of remote audit or another alternative option. So certificate extensions, what's called the GFSI remote audit, or the use of ICT audit approach in FSSC language, or full remote audits. These are the options that we have available. So talking firstly about certificate extensions, this is for an operational site where physical access is not possible. It's for current certificates, which can be then extended for their current scope of certification for up to 6 months. A risk assessment needs to be applied to this process, and if the risk assessment comes out with a low risk outcome, then the extension can be applied. If it's a high risk outcome, no extension can be applied. If there are any doubts that are raised, but they still fit in the low risk category, these extension concerns or doubts are raised in the same way that non-conformities would be raised in the FSSC 22000 processes and managed through those processes. The types of categories under FSSC 22000 where a certificate extension can be applied are Category C for food manufacturing, Category I for packaging and packaging materials, Category G for transport and storage, Category D for animal feed and pet food, and Category K for biochemical production. So it does cover the full range of FSSC options. The second option available to us in this extraordinary time is the GFSI remote audit, or as I mentioned, FSSC calls it the use of ICT audit approach. It's a two-part audit, and it comprises firstly an off-site remote assessment, which is then followed by an on-site audit within 30 days. It also, I mentioned there that it's a maximum of 90 days with a risk-based concession, and that is the case where site access was not able to be made because of pandemic conditions, so it can risk assess it and allow up to 90 days after the first part of the audit, the remote part of the audit, to then go back to the site to do the on-site portion. But if it was a regular time without pandemic or without an extraordinary event, then it would just be 30 days that is applied after the remote portion. The types of audits that we can apply the remote audit or partial remote audit option is a stage 1 audit, a surveillance or recertification audit, as well as head office audits under the FSSC banner. What's required to do this is some significant planning, considerations for information security, and also some connectivity and technology testing prior to the audit taking place. It's really essential to have all this in place. For durations, we round the duration up from a regular FSSC duration and then divide it into two parts. The two parts is generally 50%, but at least 50% of the duration must be on site in this option, so delivered on site. When I talk about rounding up, so if the calculation for duration came out at 2.2 days as an example, well then that would become 2.5 days in this particular scenario. So I mentioned that the remote audit has to be conducted first, and that remote audit may include some live video feed, which would give the auditor some familiarity of the site prior to actually visiting there in 30 to 90 days following this event. That live video feed is not mandatory, but it's certainly recommended to be able to get the auditor familiar and understand the processes that they are assessing. The on-site audit, which is done 30 to 90 days following the remote, needs to include as a bare minimum the inspection of good manufacturing practices, the implementation of the HACCP plans, and also the traceability challenge. So these three elements must be included as a minimum for the on-site portion. Of course, there may be many other things that are conducted on-site as well. The usual audit protocols of regular auditing apply in this case, to both the remote and also the on-site activities. non-conformities that are raised, if any, through the GFSI remote audit option, managed through the usual scheme processes for FSSC, and of course the same timelines for the particular non-conformance that is raised. The report that's generated out of this audit will include mention that the ICT audit approach has been used. Again, same as the extensions, the same categories apply. So category C for food, I for packaging, G for transport and storage, D for animal feed and pet food, and K for biochemical production. The third option that's available to us, and the one that's most recently released, is the full remote audit. It's an announced audit. It covers all aspects of the scheme. This type of audit is accredited, but it is not GFSI recognised. It's an important factor to take into consideration. And so it is a proper audit. It is to the full scheme requirements, but GFSI does not endorse full remote audits. We can apply the full remote audit option to an annual surveillance or recertification. We can also use it for a transition audit where a site wants to transition from ISO 22000 as an example, or any other GFSI scheme that has the same scope of certification as the proposed FSSC scope of certification. You can also use it for certificates that have been transferred from one certification body to another, and then conduct either the surveillance or the recertification according to wherever the particular site is up to in its FSSC cycle. We can close non-conformities where necessary through a full remote audit, and we can also use it where a GFSI remote audit, so one of those partial remote audits, has been conducted, but we can't get back to deliver part 2 of the audit. Of course, and unfortunately, if part 2 can't be delivered and a full remote audit is deployed, then it's the full remote audit and the full duration that has to be applied. So we can't halve the next part of the full remote audit and just audit the parts that weren't audited remotely in the first instance. We have to go back and do an entire proper full duration again, fully remote. There are also the use of special audits, which follow serious event assessments. So sometimes when we're doing a certificate extension, during the risk assessment, something's identified that is not quite right, and we need to return to the site. Normally, we can't return to the site, so we can use a full remote audit to be able to make that assessment. Again, the usual audit protocols apply to full remote audits, so it's just like any other audit as far as rules and behaviours go. We can apply full remote audits to the same series of categories: C, I, G, D, and K. So now we've spoken about the options that were available to us that FSSC's presented. I want to talk a bit about the benefits of remote auditing. Of course, once we deploy remote auditing, it helps us to maintain the cycles of certification, and of course helps us manage the food safety risk that's associated with the products that are being produced. When someone's looking in from outside, it always assists in the way that a site deals with its food safety culture, because they know that someone's watching, so it helps promote or encourage food safety culture within the site. Through remote auditing, we can access a greater pool of expert auditors from around the world, and so this is quite handy as long as language is not a barrier, or understanding of the particular country's legislation or regulations. Then we can deploy auditors from any part of the world to be able to fulfill the needs of one of our clients for one of these audits. There's, of course, the associated reduction in carbon footprint and expenses because of the reduced travel, so that's always a positive. And it provides us much more flexibility because, one, the auditors aren't spending the amount of time traveling to and from the audits, so they've got a little bit more time in their lives, but they can also be used more efficiently, so it gives a degree of flexibility. flexibility also in that some of these audits could be broken up. So you may have a 2-day audit to deliver, but that 2-day audit could be done as 4 half days, whereas we would tend not to do that in a regular face-to-face audit. We tend to go in and just do 2 days straight. Remote auditing does engage and encourage more people from the organisation being audited to be involved, because regardless of where they're based, they feel like they can then join in. They've got much more connectivity. In the past, maybe if they were based at a different site, travel might not allow them to, or the expensive travel might mean that they're not involved in the audit, and this way they can actually be much more involved. But with benefits come challenges as well, and there are certainly some challenges of remote auditing. So there's less personal interaction. It can be quite difficult talking to people that you've not met. It can be daunting, particularly if it's a case like we're talking about here, where we can't see each other's faces. It's certainly got challenges. Time management can also be a bit of an issue during the remote audits if planning is not conducted properly and not communicated properly. Some sites we see have got quite a lot of paper-based documentation, and that can be quite inefficient to share through a remote audit because there's quite a lot of copying and scanning involved to get what used to be able to be just handed across a table to an auditor. Now it has to be put into some electronic format and then shared. There are the potentials for technology failures. We don't see them often, but when we do see them, they can be considerable. And so this is where we do have some options to, well, it's essential to test. I'll talk about that in a minute. Some sites, when we go to do the full remote audit, and we need to be able to see across the entire site, anywhere that an auditor would normally travel across the site, can be difficult because we can get some areas compromised, connectivity issues. So from that perspective, it can be a bit of a challenge. Quite hard to read body language on the other end of a call at times, or with a number of people. I think our ability as humans and our peripheral vision is quite strong generally, and we might miss out on some of the non-verbal cues when we're doing a remote audit. So it's definitely important to try and get as much face contact as possible through cameras and open communication. And with the lack of being able to read body language, sometimes an auditor might miss some of those non-verbal cues and not realise that the auditee really needs to go and have a break, go to the bathroom, or whatever it is that they need to do, and the auditor might just tend to keep pushing through rather than reading the room. So some tips to combat some of these challenges. I've mentioned a couple of times already, but it's very important to maintain the usual protocols of auditing. So all the rules that go with auditing need to be talked about and agreed to and observed. Generally speaking, more planning time is required to do a remote audit because you've got to consider many different facets that may usually be able to be worked out on site at the time. Once a plan is put together, then it's very important to follow that plan. And one of the things that should be part of that plan is some breaks to be scheduled and also taken. Give everyone a bit of a break and a bit of a refresh. It can be quite exhausting, days on days of auditing in the same way that we're talking now. It's pretty important that some sort of quiet area is created for the audit to be taking place, the paper sharing, the documentation records, as well as interviews with people, because it's quite distracting otherwise. Of course, we do need to get out into the factory or into the production area in a full remote audit. We'll talk about that soon. A list of documentation and records is really essential up front from the auditor, so that the site can be prepared and don't spend an enormous amount of time looking for these things that are essential to be able to complete the audit. In some cases, information might be able to be provided to the auditor by the site up front, prior to the audit, which can make the audit much more efficient and enable the auditor to become a little more familiar with what they're going to be looking at down the track. So here we're talking about things like a site plan, maybe HACCP plans, information that we would usually ask for quite early in the audit, just to be able to get our heads around what we're going to be looking at and contextualize the rest of the duration of the audit. So if the site has all the information that's been requested, records, documents, etc., ready, it can really avoid some significant delays. From a technology point of view, we need to consider it up front. What are we going to be using? What's that technology? Does it all work? Does everyone have access to it? And do we have enough of it to consider the multiple parties and locations that could be involved in the audit? So does it facilitate what we want it to do? It's really critical to verify the Wi-Fi strength in the production areas for being able to manage a live video feed for the auditor to be taken on a tour live through all parts of the production, storage, and other parts of the site. So I've mentioned it once already, but everywhere that an auditor would normally go, it needs to be visited during this audit. So we need to have good strength of Wi-Fi throughout. So that requires some testing up front, and then if that testing fails, repeat the testing. Otherwise, we would have to give up on if it wasn't be able to connect, or we didn't get sufficient coverage, then we'd have to look at a different option. Remote auditing may not be possible. Another consideration that the site has to take into account is the ability, the authority to take mobile technology into production areas. Things like glass, of course, aren't friendly to those areas, so we have to take that into account, as well as sometimes electronics as well. So electronics themselves can be problematic. They can create explosions in certain environments. So we need to make sure that we're covering that. And we actually have at BSI some options for electronics that don't create that static problem. So they are safe in explosive environments, but if we're talking about general, a telephone or a tablet, we have to make sure that it's okay for it to go where we're proposing it to go. The use of some sort of noise cancelling technology, headphones, microphones, etc., so that we don't deafen the auditor through the experience, and that the auditor can actually hear people being interviewed in the factory or in the production area on the line, is important. If we do have a technology failure through the remote audit itself, we need to, of course, try again. But if we can't get connectivity, then we need to reschedule the audit to fulfill it at another time. So the site tour, using the remote technology, it's important that we take into consideration all the different elements or the different components that could be used. There may be fixed video cameras in certain parts of the facility that could be given access to the auditor. They could be tapped into those camera feeds and be able to see parts of what's going on. We can also use the mobile phone or tablet technology to use for video and audio sharing throughout throughout a tour. And photography may be used, particularly for some close-up of detail. So it could be labels, or it could be other things that could be shared to the auditor. And wearable video camera technology is also a possibility. So BSI does use some helmet technology in some remote auditing, as well as some other headset style technologies to be able to share effectively. So that takes me to the end of my sharing, but also provides the opportunity for you to ask any questions if there are any. I'm not sure if any have come through in the chat since we've been talking now.
Hi, Hi Todd, it's Cara here. Just to make sure our tech is functioning, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, thanks.
Fantastic. Actually, we do have several questions, so it's been a very engaging session indeed. The first one is, why does the GFSI not recognize the full remote option, and is this being discussed further with the GFSI?
Yes, well, GFSI is very reluctant, and they've just actually released I suppose, reiterated their position on it in the last 24 hours. So they are looking into it, and they're studying it, and they're looking into the science and the data that sits behind it, they're not convinced about the efficacy of a full remote audit to be able to perform the function of food safety auditing. That was, in essence, what they were saying in their statement. But they are taking it into consideration, and they're asking for data to be provided as part of their investigation that they're undertaking. We, as BSI, as well as various other industry bodies, have certainly been vocal with GFSI, and I myself have been directly involved in that, in trying to explain to them the possibilities that are available and how effective those possibilities are. We have collectively put together quite a lot of information and presented it to them at their request, based on the number of days of audit and the non-conformities raised compared to the same time in the last period last year, as a bit of a comparison. But at the moment, their position is quite strong, and it's a no. So yeah, unfortunate, but that's the way that it is.
Okay, now whether this question was probably could be tied to that previous one slightly, but it's around whether remote auditing will be in place after the pandemic. And it sounds like maybe with GFSI that might be more of a challenge, but what about other management systems auditing?
Well, GFSI actually, as part of their statement about the partial remote audit that they came out with, they said that it wasn't a response to COVID-19, that in fact it was just something that they believe that it should be in place or available at times. So I think we can see that style of half-half or partial remote remaining from a GFSI perspective. But I think the reality that we have to face globally now is that remote auditing won't go away. It's being used a lot, and I think that the technology is going to improve. People's familiarity with it is also going to be stronger, better, and we're going to see more of it. I don't think it's going to replace completely our traditional style of auditing, where an auditor would visit a facility and go in there, although some of the technology that's involved in that and maybe some of the prediction that's involved in that might change. But I think we'll probably see remote auditing as a supplement to the traditional auditing styles, but I don't think it's going to go away.
There's a question about how we trained our auditors to do remote audits and what their experience level is.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, we certainly train them, and one of the requirements of the schemes that have deployed various different remote audit options is that we have, as certification bodies, trained our people. So at BSI, we have a training program for remote, and it's a competency code for auditors and others that are involved in remote audits attached to that. So these people, that becomes part of their qualification, part of their experience. Having said that, it's not rocket science at all. And someone, generally speaking, and it's a bold statement, but mostly it's your first remote audit that's the tricky one. You've got it by the second time you do it. So of course, auditors will become more familiar more quickly than a site will, because sites don't get audits every day of the year, although I have heard of some sites that seem to get a lot or too many. But auditors are certainly doing it as their bread and butter. That's what they do, and they become very good at it. They become quite good at guiding the auditee into how to best get the best outcome out of the audit. Not guiding the audit from a consulting perspective, but just guiding and encouraging, coaching to get a good result out of the audit.
Great. And there's a question about whether audits will take longer remotely, and if so, is there an impact on the overall cost?
Well, the durations are supposed to stay the same, and we've found that the remote auditing actually is a bit more efficient than traditional auditing. So there are just some small parts of the audit that seem to get missed out. Some of the general chit chat and some of that stuff seems to make the remote audit a bit quicker than a traditional face-to-face audit. From a cost perspective, the rates that BSI charges are the same, so remote or on site. There's certainly a saving if travel was involved in the past, but basically same duration, same day rate equals the same cost minus the travel.
Okay, great. You did mention that we're seeing remote audits tend to be more efficient. There's a question around whether they're as effective as on-site audits.
I think you definitely have to say that you can't smell what you're experiencing through a remote audit, and so there are times when the auditor's nose could actually take them in a certain direction just based on what they could smell. We do, from our experience, what we've seen is that I would say it's somewhere in the vicinity of 90 to 95% of the experience that the auditor is receiving is the same as if they were on site, and that's sometimes it's using quite advanced technology to do that, but the majority of the remote audits that we've been delivering are using fairly rudimentary technologies like mobile phones and like this call that we're on here today. So from the efficiency, or sorry, the effectiveness perspective, yeah, we find them to be effective, and they're certainly much more effective than no audit at all. And that's, I think that's a very important note to make.
Great. You did talk about what happens if the GFSI remote audit option, and there is no site access after 30 days, that a 90-day concession may be granted, and there's a bit more risk assessment going on there. So let's say an organization is successful in getting that 90-day concession, but that 90 days later, there still is no site access. They're still under travel restrictions. What would happen in that situation?
Well, if the certificate is still safe, as in hasn't expired, the concession's been granted, then a full remote audit can be conducted. The GFSI status of that certificate will be lost, but the certificate can become valid by, or continue being valid by performing a full remote audit. But that would require doing the full duration of that full remote audit to be able to maintain that certification.
Okay, great. And are the FSSC related fees the same for remote options, or are they asking for more or less?
Sorry, Cara, I just lost that in the middle. Could you repeat that?
No worries. There's a query about the fees, what we charge our clients on behalf of FSSC that goes directly to FSSC. We see those fees change at all with remote audits?
Yeah, no, the certificate fees that are payable to FSSC remain the same. So we charge 150 euros per certificate by FSSC. We pass that on at 150 euros directly through to our clients. So that remains the same.
Great. And one last question has just come in. It's a little bit deeper dive on the factory tour, and how does remote auditing impact the factory tour? Is it longer, shorter?
The tendency would be that it would could become shorter because the audit team may rush the auditor through. In FSSC, the duration in the factory tour needs to be 50% of the audit duration for full remote. So it's important that it actually just is 50% as a minimum of the total duration of the audit. But yeah, again, an auditor needs to be good at guiding. So saying, oh, hang on a second, just slow down. Okay, can you pan left? Right, what's that I can see in the distance there? Can you take me to it? Can you please open that door? What's behind that pole? I can see some bags on the floor. Can you lift them up for me and show me what's underneath them? That kind of thing. The auditor really needs to be doing, I guess, what they would have done with their own legs and hands, and really guide what they'd like to get out of it.
Great. Sorry, there's just a couple of questions that have literally, again, just come in, and I need to read them before I read them out, so I make sure I understand them and don't confuse you. When we do, sorry, this is actually a question from one of our colleagues. When we do remote auditing, the sampling will be quite limited. What will be the good sampling numbers during a remote audit?
Well, we should maintain similar sampling numbers that we would have if we were performing an on-site audit. So going back to the last audit date and taking a range of samples from throughout that period. So if it was 12 months, then looking over that last 12 months at a representative sample that gives the auditor confidence in what they're seeing, confidence that they've found something that's a concern, or confident that they've found something that's good and compliant. So the sampling shouldn't change.
Okay, great. And are these remote audits allowed for fresh FSSC certification?
Unfortunately not. So we can't do a stage 2 audit using the full remote audit option. So we can't bring new clients into certification.
Okay, that wraps it up for questions.
Okay, well, thank you. It's certainly been good to be able to share this information with you. Of course, if you do have any further questions that you think about afterwards, or after you receive this presentation in the email following this session, contact your local BSI office that looks after you. Certainly, if you're looking to schedule in remote audits, contact them as early as possible, because there will be a potential shortage of audit days available in the rest of the year, just due to the fact that there's been so much work being delayed from earlier in the year. There is our website on there. If you're looking for information, it's always got lots of information available there, as well as a general email address to send to if you've got some direct questions. So thank you very much for your attention. Please stay safe, look after yourselves, and take care. And yeah, thanks very much for joining. Bye-bye.